I'm Brittany. This is a very full Arthur. And welcome to Gaywatch, where we watch gay things. The time has come. The time is here. We have arrived. We are ready to start Captive Prince today. On this day, the 5th year anniversary of Gaywatch, I have chosen Captive Prince to read. For reasons that will become clear to you if you've never read this series before, and a good few of you haven't, so please no spoilers in the chat, because I have read this, but I've brought in some new people who maybe haven't experienced this before, so we get to do that right along with them. I have not read this in a while, but I have read it more than once, so I remember all the major things, but not necessarily the small things, really. And never underestimate my capacity for forgetting things. So, who knows? But I get to share this with y'all. I thought that for 5 years of Gaywatch, that it would be kind of cool for me to share something I love with you. Because every other time on this channel, for the most part, I feel like 98% of the time, I am watching things that you recommend to me. Which makes sense because this is a channel that is almost exclusively based on reaction content. You would have to recommend things to me. And for 5 years, I thought we would go into, you know, Gay Pride June and also my birthday. And 5 years of Gaywatch was something that I love that I can give back to you. And this would be it. This would be it. So, we read for a couple of hours. We take a break somewhere around halfway through. There are trigger warnings available in the description of this video. And just for a shorthand to tell whether or not you need trigger warnings, this is a world that is based on body slaves and sexual slavery. So, if you could possibly think that you might need some trigger warnings around things like that, I would click on the link that's in this description and take a look at the trigger warnings. If you are here from Urha, then, oh, hello? Oh, excuse me, there's still fire sound. Oh, that's funny. Hang on. I can take that down. One moment, please. Alrighty. Yeah, okay. So, we take a break around halfway through, trigger warnings in the description. Also, to kick off the stream, Maddie has been very generous and has given a super chat right at the start. And says, "Hi, Britt. I wanted to wait for the reading streams because that's where I see you most often. I just wanted to say you're an amazing person and I love your channel." Thank you, Maddie. I know you well. I know your name. We know each other. I know you. Thank you so much for your generosity. And this will actually, I will put this super chat towards what I am fundraising for. I did not bring this up in the 5th year anniversary stream because for something like 5 years and that kind of celebration, it didn't quite feel like the right context to bring something like fundraising into. However, I am indeed fundraising today. And what's better about this time than some of the other times is that the other times that I have been in a position to where I need to fundraise for something, it has been a rather immediate emergency. It has been for things like vet bills and certain things going on with our house that need to be addressed, and or like my computer was dying was the very first thing I ever fundraised for. So every other time it's always been a real like diehard emergency of I don't know what I'm going to do if I don't ask for help. And in this case, I finally, you know, I'm finally in a place this year to where I can ask for something that isn't technically like on fire, but is still hugely important. I am undiagnosed ADHD. I have been reasonably certain for the past decade that I am most definitely ADHD. If you talk to the wife, she will attest to this almost more passionately than I do. And technically, I have sat in front of a psychologist, and in the first 45 seconds of speaking to me in a context that had nothing to do with any of this, he was like, oh, so ADHD? And that's how apparent it is, apparently, to someone with a degree in psychology. But I have not been able to get diagnosed because that can be rather costly. But that is the only way that people who are ADHD can access medication. And the stories that I have heard of people finding the right medication for their ADHD are incredible and awe-inspiring. And if there is a possibility for that to happen to me, who has done all of this and done Gaywatch, unmedicated ADHD, that is something that I've been trying to work towards, that I have not been able to. And it seems like yet another year is going to go by without that becoming a reality for me. And so I am now taking the opportunity to ask you guys to help me with that. There are links to Ko-fi and Venmo in the description for this video. I will just be kind of continually fundraising until I hit $1,500, because assessments and diagnosis are expensive, and it's hard to get a specific price point on this kind of thing. But I do know about the average costs in North Carolina. So, and if there winds up being any excess, that will go towards dental work that I am going to have to get done pretty soon. So it will all go towards a very good cause. But I finally have the opportunity to actually ask for something that is just as big as a very immediate emergency, without having anything literally be on fire. So sorry to talk about that for a couple of minutes more than I meant to. But now we are going to start Captive Prince. And because people are very generous, I have an extra copy. I have a couple extra copies of the first volume that I will be giving away. And so for this stream and for the next stream, we are going to be taking, basically, you can enter yourself. So all you have to do is comment down below that you would like a chance to win this. And then after a couple of streams, I will put all the names in a list, hit randomize, and the first name that comes up will be the person who gets volume 1. We're going to give one away right at the top. So like right now, I'm going to give another volume 1, another copy of this Captive Prince away when we start the second book. And then at the end of the trilogy is when I will give away actually the entire trilogy. That's when we'll do the big bang, and we'll be giving away all 3 books. And they will actually be this edition is what of the entire trilogy that I'll be giving away, because I now have these covers, and these are like the OG covers, and this is what I will be actively reading on stream. So whoever wins it will also get the copies of the actual books that I have read on the streams. So who the fuck cares if we're starting late, because it's the 5th year anniversary, and it's only over when I say it's over, so we can go over, that's fine. I am, however, so sorry that we are starting a little bit late. I was talking to you guys for a while in the 5th year anniversary stream. Okay. Oh, freaking K. We are starting with the prologue. Let me catch back up with you guys into the... There we are. I just want to make sure that I'm all up on the chat and everything. Okay. All right. The prologue of Captive Prince. "We hear that your prince," said Lady Jocasta, "keeps his own harem. These slaves will please any traditionalist, but I have asked Adrastus to prepare something special in addition, a personal gift for your prince from the king, a gem in the rough, as it were." His Majesty has already been so generous, said Councillor Guyon, ambassador of Vere. They strolled the length of the viewing gallery. Guyon had dined on mouth-watering spiced meats wrapped in grape leaves, the noonday heat fanned away from his reclining form by attentive slaves. He felt generously willing to admit that this barbaric country had its charms. The food was rustic, but the slaves were impeccable, faultlessly obedient and trained to efface and anticipate, nothing like the spoiled pets at the court of Vere. The gallery was decorated by 24 slaves on display. All were either naked or barely clad in transparent silks. Around their necks the slaves wore gold collars decorated with rubies and tanzanite, and on their wrists golden wrist cuffs. These were purely ornamental. The slaves knelt in demonstration of their willing submissiveness. They were to be a gift from the new king of Aquilos to the regent of Vere, a highly generous gift. The gold alone was worth a small fortune, while the slaves were surely some of the finest in Aquilos. Privately, Guyon had already earmarked one of the palace slaves for his personal use, a demure youth with a beautifully slender waist and heavily lashed dark eyes. As they reached the far end of the gallery, Adrastus, the keeper of the royal slaves, bowed sharply, the heels of his laced brown leather boots drawing together. "Ah, here we are," said Lady Jocasta, smiling. They proceeded into an antechamber, and Guyon's eyes widened. Bound and under heavy guard was a male slave unlike any Guyon had ever seen. Powerfully muscled and physically imposing, he was not wearing the trinket chains that adorned the other slaves in the gallery. His restraints were real. His wrists were lashed behind his back, and his legs and torso were bound with thick cords. Despite this, the force of his body looked only barely contained. His dark eyes flashed furiously above the gag, and if you looked closely at the expensive cords that bound his torso and legs, you could see the red wheels where he had fought hard against his restraints. Guyon's pulse sped up, an almost panicked reaction. A gem in the rough, this slave was more like a wild animal, nothing like the 24 tame kittens who lined the hall. The sheer power of his body was barely held in check. Guyon looked at Adrastus, who was hanging back, as though the slave's presence made him nervous. "Are all the new slaves bound?" asked Guyon, trying to regain his composure. "No, just him. He, that is..." Adrastus hesitated. "Yes." "He isn't used to being handled," said Adrastus, with an uneasy sideways look at Lady Jocasta. "He hasn't been trained." "The prince, we hear, enjoys a challenge," said Lady Jocasta. Guyon tried to quell his reaction as he turned his gaze back to the slave. It was highly questionable whether this barbarous gift would appeal to the prince, whose feelings toward the savage inhabitants of Aquilos lacked warmth, to say the least. "Does he have a name?" asked Guyon. "Your prince is, of course, free to name him whatever he likes," said Lady Jocasta. "But I believe it would greatly please the king if you were to call him Damon." Her eyes glittered. "Lady Jocasta," said Adrastus, seemingly in objection, though of course that was impossible. Guyon looked from one to the other of them. He saw that he was expected to make some comment. "That is certainly an interesting choice of name," said Guyon. In fact, he was appalled. "The king thinks so," said Lady Jocasta, stretching her lips slightly. That's a scene break. They killed his slave Lycaeus with the quick slice of a sword across her throat. She was a palace slave, untrained in combat and so sweetly obedient that, had he commanded it of her, she would have knelt and bared her own throat for the stroke. She was not given a chance to obey or resist. She folded soundlessly, her pale limbs lying quite still on the white marble. Beneath her, blood began slowly to spread out over the marble floor. "Seize him," said one of the soldiers who poured into the room, a man with lank brown hair. Damon might have allowed it simply out of shock, but it was in that instant that 2 of the soldiers lay hands on Lycaeus and cut her down. At the end of the first exchange, 3 of the soldiers were dead, and Damon had possession of a sword. The men facing him wavered and held back. "Who sent you?" said Damon. The lank-haired soldier said, "The king." "Father," he almost lowered his sword. "Castor. Your father is dead. Take him." Fighting came naturally to Damon, whose abilities were born of strength, natural aptitude, and relentless practice, but these men had been sent against him by one who knew all of that very well, and further, was not stinting in his judgment of how many soldiers it would take to overcome a man of Damon's caliber. Overwhelmed by numbers, Damon could only last so long before he was taken, his arms twisted behind his back, a sword at his throat. He had then, naively, expected to be killed. Instead, he was beaten, restrained, and, when he fought free, doing a gratifying amount of damage for one who had no weapon, beaten again. "Get him out of here," said the lank-haired soldier, whipping the back of his hand across the thin line of blood at his temple. He was thrown into a cell. His mind, which ran along straight and candid lines, could not make sense of what was happening. "Take me to see my brother," he demanded, and the soldiers laughed, and one kicked him in the stomach. "Your brother's the one who gave the order," one of them sneered. "You're lying. Castor's no traitor." But the door of his cell slammed shut, and doubt raised its head for the first time. He had been naive, a small voice began to whisper. He hadn't anticipated, he hadn't seen, or perhaps he had refused to see, giving no credence to the dark rumors that seemed to disrespect the honor with which a son should treat the final days of a sick and dying father. In the morning they came for him, and understanding now all that had occurred, and wishing to meet his captor with courage and bitter pride, he allowed his arms to be lashed behind his back, submitting to rough handling and moving forward when he was propelled by a hard shove between the shoulders. When he realized where he was being taken, he began to struggle again, violently. That's a scene break. Also, by the way, I do indeed have a face claim of sorts. I've got a couple of them, actually, for this series. I tend to imagine, okay, that's a lie. I exclusively imagine that Damon is played by young Jason Momoa. And actually, as I spill tea, and actually, if you Google Jason Momoa, oddly enough, Jesus picture, you will see exactly why. By the way, we'll get to, the other one when we get there. The room was simply carved in white marble. The floor, also marble, sloped faintly, terminating at an unobtrusive carved runnel. From the ceiling hung a pair of shackles, to which Damon, forcefully resisting, was chained against his will, his arms pulled up above his head. These were the slave baths. Damon jerked against the restraints. They didn't budge. His wrists were already bruised. On this side of the water, a miscellany? A miscellany of cushions and towels were arranged in an appealing tumble. Colored glass bottles in a variety of shapes, containing a variety of oils, glimmered like jewels amid the cushions. The water was scented, milky, and decorated with slowly drowning rose petals. All the niceties. This could not be happening. Damon felt a surge in his chest, fury, outrage, and somewhere buried beneath these, a new emotion that twisted and roiled in his belly. One of the soldiers immobilized him in a practiced hold from behind. The other began to strip him. His garments were unpinned and drawn off swiftly. His sandals were cut from his feet. The burn of humiliation, hot as steam across his cheeks, Damon stood shackled, naked, the moist warmth of the baths curling up against his skin. The soldiers withdrew to the archway, where a figure dismissed them, his chiseled face handsome and familiar. Adrastus was the keeper of the royal slaves. His was a prestigious position that had been bestowed on him by King Theomedes. Damon was hit by a wave of anger so powerful it almost robbed him of vision. When he came back to himself, He saw the way Adrastus was considering him. "You wouldn't dare lay a hand on me," said Damon. "I'm under orders," said Adrastus, though he was holding back. "I'll kill you," said Damon. "Maybe a woman," said Adrastus, backing up a step and whispering into the ear of one of the attendants, who bowed and left the room. A slave entered a few moments later. Hand-picked, she matched all that was known of Damon's tastes. Her skin was as white as the marble of the baths, and her yellow hair was simply pinned, exposing the elegant column of her throat. Her breasts were full and swelled beneath the gauze. Her pink nipples were faintly visible. Damon watched her approach with the same wariness with which he would follow the movements of an opponent on the field, though he was no stranger to being serviced by slaves. Her hand rose to the clasp at her shoulder. She exposed the curve of a breast, a slender waist, the gauze sliding down to her hips, and lower. Her garments dropped to the floor. Then she picked up a water scoop. Naked, she bathed his body, soaping and rinsing, heedless of the way the water spilled against her own skin and splashed her round breasts. Finally, she wet and soaped his hair, washing it thoroughly, finishing by rising up on her toes and tipping one of the smaller tubs of warm water over the back of his head. Like a dog, he shook it off. He looked around for Adrastus, but the keeper of the slaves seemed to have disappeared. The slave took up one of the colored vials and poured some of its oil into her palm. Coating her hands, she began to work the stuff into his skin with methodical strokes, applying it everywhere. Her eyes remained downcast, even when her strokes deliberately slowed, and she moved against him. Damon's fingers bit into his chains. "That's enough," said Jocaste, and the slave jerked back from Damon, prostrating herself on the wet marble floor instantly. Damon, manifestly aroused, weathered Jocaste's calmly appraising gaze. "I want to see my brother," said Damon. "You have no brother," said Jocaste. "You have no family. You have no name, rank, or position. By now you should know that much, at least. Do you expect me to submit to this, to be mastered by, who, Adrastus? I'll tear his throat out." "Yes, you would. But you won't be serving in the palace." "Where?" Flatly. She gazed at him. Damon said, "What have you done?" "Nothing," she said. "But choose between brothers." They had last spoken in her rooms in the palace. Her hand had pressed to his arm. She looked like a painting. Her blonde curls were coiled and perfect, and her high, smooth brow and classical features were composed. Where Adrastus had held back, her delicate sandals picked their way with calm and sure steps across the wet marble towards him. He said, "Why keep me alive? What need does this satisfy? It's need enough, except for that. Is it?" He bit down on it. She deliberately misunderstood his words. "A brother's love? You don't know him at all, do you? What's a death but easy, quick? It's supposed to haunt you forever, that the one time he beat you was the one time that mattered." Damon felt his face changing shape. "What?" She touched his jaw, unafraid. Her fingers were slender, white, and faultlessly elegant. "I see why you prefer pale skin," she said. "Yours hides the bruising." That's a scene break. Also, the very clever way that C.S. Picot just kind of wove in Damon's tastes for pale blondes moments before we get Jocaste's description. After they locked him into the gold collar and wrist cuffs, they painted his face. There was no taboo in Aquilos regarding male nudity, but the paint was the mark of a slave, and it was mortifying. He thought there was no greater humiliation than when he was thrown to the ground in front of Adrastus. Then he saw Adrastus's face, and saw the esurient expression. "You look Adrastus gazed at him. Damon's arms were bound behind his back, and further restraints had restricted his movements to little more than a hobble. Now he was sprawled on the ground at Adrastus's feet. He drew himself up onto his knees, but was prevented from rising further by the restraining grip of his two guards. "If you did it for a position," said Damon, flat hatred in his voice, "you're a fool. You'll never advance. He can't trust you. You've already betrayed for gain once." The blow snapped his head to one side. Damon ran his tongue over the inside of his lip and tasted blood. "I did not give you permission to speak," said Adrastus. "You hit like a milk-fed catamite," said Damon. Adrastus took a step back, his face white. "Gag him," he said, and Damon was struggling again, in vain, against the guards. His jaw was expertly prized open, and a thickly cloth-bound iron bit forced into his mouth and swiftly tied. He could make no more than a muffled sound, but he glared at Adrastus over the gag with defiant eyes. "You don't understand it yet," said Adrastus, "but you will. You'll come to understand that what they are saying in the palace, in the taverns, and in the streets is true. You're a slave. You're worth nothing. Prince Damianos is dead." That's the end of the chapter. Or excuse me, the end of the prologue. We're on page 11 for chapter 1. I cannot fucking tell you how excited I am. Damon came back to himself in stages, his drugged limbs heavy against the silk cushions, the gold cuffs on his wrists like lead weights. His eyelids raised and lowered. The sounds he heard made no sense at first, the murmur of voices speaking Varetian. Instinct said, "Get up." He gathered himself, pushing up onto his knees. Varetian voices. His muddled thoughts, arriving at this conclusion, could make nothing of it at first. His mind was harder than his body to muster. He could not immediately remember anything after his capture, though he knew that time had passed between now and then. He was aware that at some point he had been drugged. He searched for that memory. Eventually he found it. He had tried to escape. He had been transported inside a locked wagon under heavy guard to a house on the edge of the city. He had been pulled from the wagon into a closed courtyard, and he remembered bells. The courtyard had filled with the sudden sound of bells, a cacophony of sound from the highest places in the city, carrying in the warm evening air. So, I have read this before, and I remember a lot, although I'm sure not everything by a long stretch. However, I will be keeping this as new reader friendly as absolutely possible, so I will not be talking about things until they happen. So I will not go into specifics about stuff until it has been very clearly, established. Just so you know, the new readers don't have to worry about it. The old readers know exactly why I am choosing this moment to say this, and I will bring it up when it becomes relevant. Bells at dusk, heralding a new king. Theomedes is dead. All hail Castor. At the sound of the bells, the need to escape had overwhelmed any urge to caution or subterfuge, part of the fury and grief that came upon him in waves. The starting of the horses had given him his opportunity. But he had been unarmed and surrounded by soldiers, in a closed courtyard. The subsequent handling had not been delicate. They had thrown him into a cell deep in the bowels of the house, after which they had drugged him. Days had bled into one another. Of the rest he recalled only brief snatches, including his stomach sank, the slap and spray of salt water, transportation aboard a ship. His head was clearing. His head was clearing for the first time in how long? How long since his capture? How long since the bells had rung? How long had he allowed this to go on? A surge of will drove Damon from his knees onto his feet. He must protect his household, his people. He took a step. A chain rattled. The tiled floor slid under his feet dizzily. His vision swam. He struck out for support and steadied himself, one shoulder against the wall. With an effort of will, he did not slide back down it. Holding himself upright, he forced the dizziness back. Where was he? He made his hazy mind take inventory of himself and his surroundings. He was dressed in the brief garments of an Aquilan slave, and from head to toe he was clean. He supposed this meant he had been tended, though his mind could supply him with no memory of it happening. He retained the gold collar and the gold cuffs on his wrists. His collar was chained to an iron link in the floor by means of a chain and a lock. Thin hysteria threatened for a moment. He smelled faintly of roses. As for the room, everywhere he looked his eyes were assaulted with ornamentation. The walls were overrun by decoration. The wooden doors were delicate as a screen and carved with a repeated design that included gaps in the wood. Through them you could glimpse shadowy impressions of what lay on the other side. The windows were similarly screened. Even the floor tiles were party-colored and arranged in a geometric pattern. Everything gave the impression of patterns within patterns, the twisty creations of the Varetian mind. It came together then, suddenly, Varetian voices, the humiliating presentation to Counselor Guyan. Are all the new slaves bound? The ship and its destination. This was Vare. Damon stared around himself in horror. He was in the heart of enemy territory, hundreds of miles from home. It didn't make sense. He was breathing, without holes, and had not suffered the regrettable accident he might have expected. Hang on. I'm coming back. There we go. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Did that, if that had no effect for you, then it had no effect for me either. It's just this page like died for a second and I had to reload it. But if you didn't see anything, fantastic, because I definitely saw something on my end. So just making sure that we're all good. Awesome. Because that just about stopped my heart there for a second. We were up here, Oh, we were towards the top of this page, actually. I'll start that sentence over again. He was breathing without holes, and had not suffered the regrettable accident he might have expected. The Varetian people had good reason to hate Prince Damianos of Aquilos. Why was he still alive? The sound of a bolt being thrown back jerked his attention to the door. Two men strode into the room. Watching them warily, Damon indistinctly recognized the first as a Varetian handler from the ship. The second was a stranger, dark-haired, bearded, wearing Varetian clothing, with silver rings on each of the 3 joints of every finger. "This is the slave that is being presented to the prince," said the ringed man. The handler nodded. "You say he's dangerous. What is he? A prisoner of war? A criminal?" The handler shrugged a who knows. "Keep him chained." "Don't be foolish. We can't keep him chained forever." Damon could feel the ringed man's gaze lingering on him. The next words were almost admiring. "Look at him. Even the prince is going to have his hands full." "Aboard the ship, when he made trouble, he was drugged," said the handler. "I see." The man's gaze turned critical. "Gag him and shorten the chain for the prince's viewing, and arrange an appropriate escort. If he makes trouble, do whatever you have to." He spoke with dismissive words, as though Damon was of minimal importance to him, no more than a task on a checklist. It was dawning on Damon, through the clearing drug haze, that his captors did not know the identity of their slave. A prisoner of war. A criminal. He let out a careful breath. He must stay quiet, inconspicuous. Enough presence of mind had returned to him to know that as Prince Damianos, he would be unlikely to last a night alive in Ver. Better by far to be thought a nameless slave. He allowed the handling. He had judged the exits and the quality of the guards in his escort. The quality of the guards was less significant than the quality of the chain around his neck. His arms were lashed behind his back, and he was gagged, the collar chain shortened to only 9 links, so that even kneeling, his head was bowed, and he could barely look up. Guards took up position on either side of him, and on either side of the doors, which he faced. He had time then to feel the expectant silence of the room, and the tightening string of heartbeats in his chest. There was a sudden flurry of activity, voices and footsteps approaching. The prince's viewing. The regent of Ver held the throne for his nephew, the crown prince. Damon knew almost nothing about the prince, except that he was the younger of 2 sons. The older brother and former heir, Damon well knew, was dead. A scattering of courtiers... Courtiers? Scattering of courtiers, I think, was entering the room. The courtiers were nondescript except for one, a young man with an astonishingly lovely face, the kind of face that would have earned a small fortune on the slave block in Aquilos. Damon's attention caught and held. The young man had yellow hair, blue eyes, and very fair skin. The dark blue of his severe, hard-laced clothing was too harsh for his fair coloring, and stood in stark contrast to the overly ornate style of the rooms. Unlike the courtiers who trailed in his wake, he wore no jewelry, not even rings on his fingers. As he approached, Damon saw that the expression that sat on the lovely face was arrogant and unpleasant. Damon knew the type. Self-absorbed and self-serving, raised to overestimate his own worth and indulge in petty tyrannies over others. Spoiled. "I hear the king of Aquilos has sent me a gift," said the young man, who was Laurent, Prince of Ver. That's a scene break. Playing Laurent, Prince of Ver in my head, always and forever, is Bradley James, circa 2011, 2012. If you don't know Merlin, and Arthur is who I mean. That's who he's named after, actually. Then I would Google Bradley James 2011, 2012, 2010. Yeah. He is the Laurent in my head. And a young Jason Momoa is Damon in my head. Can't get away from it. Always been that way. That's what came to me the first time I read it, and it hasn't left. Haven't seen anything better, actually. An Aquilin groveling on its knees. How fitting. Around him, Damon was aware of the attention of courtiers. I've really got to look up how to pronounce that. I didn't realize that I'd only ever read that word until now. Courtier. Courtiers. We'll go with courtiers for now. Damon was aware of the attention of courtiers, gathered to witness the prince's receipt of his slave. Laurent had stopped dead the moment he had seen Damon, his face turning white as though in reaction to a slap or an insult. Damon's view, half truncated by the short chain at his neck, had been enough to see that, but Laurent's expression had shuddered quickly. That he was only one of a larger consignment of slaves was something Damon had guessed, and the murmurs from the 2 courtiers nearest him confirmed it gratingly. Laurent's eyes were passing over him, as though viewing merchandise. Damon felt a muscle slide in his jaw. Counselor Guyan spoke. "He's intended as a pleasure slave, but he isn't trained. Castor suggested that you might like to break him at your leisure." "I'm not desperate enough that I need to soil myself with filth," said Laurent. "Yes, your highness." "Break him on the cross. I believe that will discharge my obligation to the King of Aquilos. Yes, Your Highness. He could feel the relief in Councillor Guyan. Handlers were quickly motioned to take him away. Damon supposed that he had presented rather a challenge to diplomacy. Castor's gift blurred the line between munificent and appalling. The courtiers were making to leave. This mockery was over. He felt the handler bend to the iron link in the floor. They were going to unchain him to take him to the cross. He flexed his fingers, gathering himself, his eyes on the handler, his single opponent. "Wait," said Laurent. The handler halted, straightening. Laurent came forward a few paces to stand in front of Damon, gazing down at him with an unreadable expression. "I want to speak to him. Remove the gag." "He's got a mouth on him," warned the handler. "Your Highness, if I might suggest," began Councillor Guyan. "Do it." Damon ran his tongue around the inside of his mouth after the handler released the cloth. "What's your name, sweetheart?" said Laurent, not quite pleasantly. He knew better than to answer any question posed in that saccharine voice. He lifted his eyes to Laurent's. That was a mistake. They gazed at each other. "Perhaps he's defective," suggested Guyan. Pellucid, good word. Pellucid blue eyes rested on his. Laurent repeated the question slowly in the language of Aquilos. The words came out before he could stop them. "I speak your language better than you speak mine, sweetheart." His words, carrying only the barest trace of an Aquilan accent, were intelligible to all, which earned him a hard blow from the handler. For good measure, a member of the escort pushed his face right down to the floor. "The King of Aquilos says, if it pleases you, call him Damon," said the handler, and Damon felt his stomach drop. There were a few shocked murmurs from the courtiers in the chamber. The atmosphere, already this is hard for me, prurient, became electric. "They thought a slave nicknamed for their late prince would amuse you. It's in poor taste. They are an uncultured society," said Councillor Guyan. This time Laurent's tone didn't change. "I heard that the King of Aquilos may marry his mistress, the Lady Jocaste. Is that true?" There was no official announcement, but there was talk of the possibility, yes. "So the country will be ruled by a bastard and a whore," said Laurent. How appropriate. Damon felt himself react, even restrained as he was, with a hard jerk aborted by chains. He caught the self-satisfied pleasure on Laurent's face. Laurent's words had been loud enough to carry to every courtier in the room. "Shall we have him taken to the cross, Your Highness?" said the handler. "No," said Laurent. "Restrain him here in the harem, after you teach him some manners." That's a scene break. The two men entrusted to the task went about it with methodical and matter-of-fact brutality. But they had a natural reluctance to damage Damien totally beyond repair, being that he was the prince's possession. Damon was aware of the ringed man issuing a series of instructions, then departing. "Keep the slave restrained here in the harem. The prince's orders. No one is to come in or out of the room. The prince's orders. 2 guards at the door at all times. The prince's orders. Don't let him off the chain. The prince's orders." Though the 2 men lingered, it seemed that the blows had stopped. Damon pushed himself up slowly to his hands and knees. Gritty tenacity made something of the situation. His head, at least, was now perfectly clear. Worse than the beating had been the viewing. He had been more shaken by it than he would admit. If the collar chain had not been so short, so impossibly secure, he might have resisted, despite his earlier resolve. He knew the arrogance of this nation. He knew how the Varetians thought of his people. Barbarian, slave. Damon had gathered all his good intentions about himself, and endured it. But the prince, Laurent's particular blend of spoiled arrogance and petty spite, had been unbearable. "He doesn't look much like a pet," said the taller of the 2 men. "You heard, he's a bed slave from Aquilos," said the other. "You think the prince fucks him?" Skeptically. "More like the other way around." Pretty sweet orders for a bed slave. The taller one's mind stuck on the subject as the other grunted non-committally in reply. Think what that'd be like, getting a leg over the prince. I imagine it would be a lot like lying down with a poisonous snake, thought Damon, but he kept the thought to himself. As soon as the men left, Damon reviewed his situation. Getting free was not yet possible. His hands were untied again, and the collar chain had been lengthened, but it was too thick to separate from the iron link in the floor. Nor could the collar be opened. It was gold, technically a soft metal, but it was also too thick to manipulate, a constant, heavy weight around his neck. It struck him how ridiculous it was to collar a slave with gold. The gold wrist cuffs were even more foolish. They would be a weapon in a close fight and currency on the journey back to Aquilos. If he stayed alert while pretending to compliance, opportunity would follow. There was enough length in the chain to allow him perhaps 3 steps of movement in every direction. There was a wooden carafe of water well within reach. He would be able to lie comfortably on the cushions and even relieve himself in a gilt copper pot. He had not been drugged or bludgeoned all the way to unconsciousness, as had happened in Aquilos. Only 2 guards at the door, an unbolted window. Freedom was attainable. If not now, then soon. It must be soon. Time was not on his side. The longer he was kept here, the longer Castor would have to cement his rule. It was unbearable not to know what was happening in his country, to his supporters, and to his people. And there was another problem. No one had yet recognized him, but that didn't mean he was safe from discovery. Aquilos and Ver had had few dealings since the decisive battle of Marlis 6 years ago, but somewhere in Ver there would surely be a person or two who knew his face, having visited his city. Castor had sent him to the one place where he could expect to be treated worse as a prince than as a slave. Elsewhere, one of his captors, learning his identity, might be convinced to help him, either out of sympathy for his situation or for the promise of a reward. Wow, the old school speech impediment is coming back from Damon's supporters in Aquilos. Not in Ver. In Ver, he couldn't risk it. He remembered the words of his father on the eve of the Battle of Marlis, warning him to fight, never to trust, because a Varishan would not keep his word. His father had been proven right that day on the battlefield. He would not think of his father. It would be best to be well rested. With that in mind, he drank water from the carafe, watching the last of the afternoon light slowly drain from the room. When it was dark, he lay his body, with all its aches, down on the cushions, and eventually he slept. Another scene break. And woke. Dragged up, a hand on his collar chain until he was on his feet, flanked by 2 of the faceless, interchangeable guards. The room was flaring into brightness as a servant lit torches and placed them in the wall brackets. The room was not over-large, and the flickering of the torches transformed its intricate designs into a continuously moving, sinuous play of shape and light. In the center of this activity, regarding him with cool blue eyes, was Laurent. Laurent's severe dark blue clothing fitted him repressively, covering him from toe to neck, long-sleeved to his wrists, with no openings that weren't done up with a series of tight, intricate ties that looked like they would take about an hour to loosen. The warm light of the torches did nothing to soften the effect. Damon saw nothing that did not confirm his earlier opinion. Spoiled, like fruit too long on the vine. Laurent's slightly lidded eyes, the slackness around his mouth, spoke of a night wasted in a dissolute courtier's overindulgence in wine. "I've been thinking about what to do with you," said Laurent. "Break you on a flogging post. Or maybe use you the way Castor intended you be used. I think that would please me a great deal." Laurent came forward until he stood just 4 paces away. It was a carefully chosen distance. Damon judged that if he strained the chain to its limit, pulling it taut, they would almost, but not quite, touch. "Nothing to say? Don't tell me you're shy now that you and I are alone." Laurent's silken tone was neither reassuring nor pleasant. "I thought you wouldn't soil yourself with a barbarian," said Damon, careful to keep his voice neutral. He was aware of the beat of his heart. "I wouldn't," said Laurent. "But if I gave you to one of the guards, I might lower myself as far as watching. Damon felt himself recoil, couldn't keep his reaction off his face. You don't like that idea, said Laurent. Maybe I can think of a better one. Come here. Distrust and dislike of Laurent roiled within him, but Damon recalled his situation. In Aquilos, he had thrown himself against his restraints, and they had grown ever tighter as a result. Here, he was just a slave, and a chance to escape would come if he did not ruin it with hot-headed pride. He could endure Laurent's juvenile, pinprick sadism. Damon must get back to Aquilos, and that meant that for now he must do as he was told. He took a wary step forward. No, said Laurent, with satisfaction. Crawl. Crawl. It was as though everything ground to a halt in the face of that single order. The part of Damon's mind that told him he must feign obedience was drowned out by his pride. But Damon's reaction of scornful disbelief only had time to register on his face for a split second before he was sent sprawling onto his hands and knees by the guards after a wordless signal from Laurent. In the next moment, again responding to a signal from Laurent, one of the guards drove his fist into Damon's jaw. Once, then again, and again. His head rang. Blood from his mouth dripped onto the tile. He stared at it, forcing himself with an effort of will not to react. Take it. Opportunity would come later. He tested his jaw. Not broken. You were insolent this afternoon, too. That is a habit that can be cured. With a horsewhip. Laurent's gaze tracked over Damon's body. Damon's garments had loosened under the rough hands of the guards bearing his torso. You have a scar. He had two, but the one that was now visible lay just below his left collarbone. Damon felt for the first time the stir of real danger, the flicker of his own quickening pulse. I served in the army. It wasn't a lie. So Castor sends a common soldier to rut with a prince. Is that it? Damon chose his words carefully, wishing he had his half-brother's facility for falsehood. Castor wished to humiliate me. I suppose I angered him. If he had another purpose in sending me here, I don't know what it is. The bastard king disposes of his waste by tossing it at my feet. Is that supposed to appease me? Said Laurent. Would anything? Said a voice behind him. Laurent turned. You find fault in so much lately. Uncle, said Laurent. I didn't hear you come in. Uncle? Damon experienced his second shock of the night. If Laurent addressed him as uncle, this man, whose imposing shape filled the doorway, was the regent. There was no physical resemblance between the regent and his nephew. The regent was a commanding man in his 40s, bulky with heavy shoulders. His hair and beard were dark brown, without even the highlights to suggest that a blonde of Laurent's fair coloring could have sprung from the same branch of the family tree. The regent looked Damon briefly up and down. The slave appears to have self-inflicted bruising. He's mine. I can do with him what I like. Not if you intend having him beaten to death. That's not a suitable use for the gift of King Castor. We have a treaty with Aquilos, and I won't see it jeopardized by petty prejudice. Petty prejudice, said Laurent. I expect you to respect our allies and the treaty, as do we all. I suppose the treaty says that I am to play pet with the dregs of the Aquilan army? Don't be childish. Bed who you like, but value the gift of King Castor. You have already shirked your duty on the border. You will not avoid your responsibilities at court. Find some appropriate use for the slave. That is my order, and I expect you to obey it. It seemed for a moment as if Laurent would rebel, but he bit down on the reaction and said only, Yes, uncle. Now, come, let us put this matter behind us. Thankfully, I was informed of your activities before they progressed far enough to cause serious inconvenience. Yes, How lucky that you were informed. I would hate to inconvenience you, uncle. This was said smoothly, but there was something behind the words. The regent answered in a similar tone. I am glad we are in accord. Their departure should have been a relief. So should the regent's intervention with his nephew. But Damon recalled the look in Laurent's blue eyes, and though left alone with the remainder of the night to rest undisturbed, he could not have said whether the regent's mercy had improved his situation or worsened it. That's the end of chapter 1. We are on page 27 for chapter 2. We are a little bit past 4, or a bit past 4. And so I'll say, after that banger of an opening salvo, we'll go ahead and take a short break. I probably will do my best to keep it shorter than usual. So instead of like 10 minutes, maybe more like 5, so that we can get some maximum reading possible. That's the prologue in the first chapter of Captive Prince. I must say, I forgot about the crawl command. I forgot about that. Ooh. It didn't quite come to fruition, but just the command alone was devastating enough. And that, obviously, does not even remotely scratch the surface of what we're in for. And yet, in terms of setting the tone, overall, the prologue in chapter 1 does a very, very good job. So we're going to take a break just for a few minutes. You get to go back into the Gaywatch kitchen. And I will return for chapter 2 and maybe more, depends on how quickly it goes by, of Captive Prince. Remember, if you would like to win this specific copy of Captive Prince, you can go ahead and comment down below that you would like to be entered, and you will be entered. And we'll be doing that for this stream and the next one. So don't worry if you're just catching up on this stream and you think that the window has passed. You can probably still enter if you're just now catching up with it. So I'll be back in a few minutes for more. I'm so excited. I'm bursting to say so many things and I can't. I'll be right back. And we're back. Okay. Ooh, all right. Let me get that out of the way. Let me get everything arranged in the way that it needs to be arranged. Yes, break over already. Not too terribly long. Want to get in the most amount of words possible. And also because this isn't, because, you know, Seven Seas produces all of the Dan May novels that I've read so far. So I'm used to exactly how long it takes to get X amount of pages in for one stream. But this is obviously, you know, new. So I'm not entirely sure how much we can expect to cover each time. So I'm trying to get the most out of it just in case it takes a bit longer. Now, we are once again on page 27 for chapter 2 of Captive Prince. The regent was here last night. The man with the rings on his fingers greeted Damon with no preamble. When Damon nodded, he frowned, 2 lines in the center of his forehead. What was the prince's mood? Delightful, said Damon. The ringed man gave him a hard stare. He broke from it to give a brief order to the servant who was clearing away the remains of Damon's meal. Then he spoke again to Damon. Ooh. How to pronounce this name? I am... Radel or Radel? Radel? Radel. I'll go with Radel. But I'll have to look that up. It's R-A-D-E-L. And that could go a couple of different ways. Plus, Ver is very French coded, so I'm not sure if there's something a little French that's supposed to be there too. Riddell. We'll go with Riddell for now. I am Riddell. I am the overseer. I have only one thing to explain to you. They say that in Aquilos you attacked your guards. If you do that here, I will have you drugged as you were aboard the ship and have various privileges removed. Do you understand? Yes. Another stare, as though this answer was in some way suspect. It is your honor to have joined the prince's household. Many desire such a position. Whatever your disgrace in your own country, it has brought you to a position of privilege here. You should bow down on your knees in gratitude to the prince that this is so. Your pride should be put aside, and the petty business of your former life forgotten. You exist only to please the crown prince, for whom this country is held in stewardship, who will ascend the throne as king. Yes, said Damon, and did his best to look grateful and accepting. Waking, there had been no confusion as to where he was, unlike yesterday. His memory was very clear. His body had immediately protested Laurent's mistreatment, but Damon, taking a brief inventory, had judged his hurts no worse than those he had occasionally received in the training area, and put the matter to one side. As Riddell spoke, Damon heard the faraway sound of an unfamiliar stringed instrument playing a Varetian melody. Sound traveled through these doors and windows with their many little apertures. The irony was that in some ways, Riddell's description of his situation as privileged was correct. This was not the rank cell he had inhabited in Aquilos, nor was it the drugged, hazily remembered confinement aboard the ship. This room was not a prison room. It was part of the royal pet residences. Damon's meal had been served on a gilt plate intricately modeled with foliage, and when the evening breeze lifted, in through the screened windows came the delicate scent of jasmine and frangipani. Except that it was a prison, except that he had a collar and chain around his neck, and was alone, among enemies, many miles from home. His first privilege was to be blindfolded and taken, complete with escort, to be washed and readied, a ritual he had learned in Aquilos. The palace outside of his rooms remained a blindfolded mystery. The sound of the stringed instrument grew briefly louder, then faded into a half-heard echo. Once or twice he heard the low, musical sound of voices. Once a laugh, soft and lover-like. As he was taken through the pet residences, Damon remembered that he was not the only Aquilan to have been gifted to Ver, and he felt a groundswell of concern for the others. Sheltered Aquilan palace slaves would likely be disoriented and vulnerable, never having learned the skills they needed to fend for themselves. Could they even talk to their masters? They were schooled in various languages, but Varetian was not likely to be one of them. Dealings with Ver were limited and, until the arrival of Councillor Guyan, largely hostile. The only reason Damon had that language was because his father had insisted that, for a prince, learning the words of an enemy was as important as learning the words of a friend. The blindfold was removed. He would never get used to the ornamentation. From its arched ceiling to the depression in which lapped the water of the baths, the room was covered in tiny painted tiles, gleaming in blues, greens, and gold. All sound was reduced to hollow echoes and curling steam. A series of curved alcoves for dalliance, currently empty, ringed the walls, by each of them braziers in fantastic shapes. The fretted doors were not wood, but metal. The only instrument of restraint was an incongruous heavy wooden dock. It did not match the rest of the baths at all, and Damon tried not to think that it had been brought here expressly for him. Averting his eyes from it, he found himself looking at the metal intaglio of the door. Figures twined around one another, all male. Their positions were not ambiguous. He shifted his eyes back to the baths. They are natural hot springs, Riddell explained, as though to a child. The water comes from a great underground river that is hot. A great underground river that is hot. Damon said, in Aquilos we use a system of aqueducts to achieve the same effect. Riddell frowned. I suppose you think that is very clever. He was already signaling to one of the servants, his manner slightly distracted. They stripped him and washed him without tying him up, and Damon behaved with admirable docility, resolved to prove that he could be trusted with small freedoms. Perhaps it worked. Or perhaps Riddell was used to tractable charges. An overseer, not a jailer, for he said, "You will soak. 5 minutes." Curved steps descended into the water. His escort retreated outside. His collar was released from its chain. Damon immersed himself in the water, enjoying the brief, unexpected sensation of freedom. The water was so hot it was almost on the threshold of tolerance, yet it felt good. The heat seeped into him, melting the ache of abused limbs and loosening muscles that were locked hard with tension. Riddell had thrown a substance into the braziers as he left, so that they flared and then smoked. Almost immediately the room had filled with an oversweet scent mingling with the steam. It perfused the senses, and Damon felt himself relax further. His thoughts, drifting a little, found their way to Laurent. "You have a scar." Damon's fingers slid across his wet chest, reaching his collarbone and then following the line of the faint pale scar, feeling an echo of the uneasiness that had stirred in him last night. It was Laurent's older brother who had inflicted that scar 6 years ago in battle at Marlis. August, the heir and pride of Vere. Damon recalled his dark golden hair, the starburst blazon of the crown prince on his shield splattered over with mud, with blood, dented and almost unrecognizable, like his once fine filigree armor. He recalled his own desperation in those moments, the scrape of metal against metal, the harsh sounds of breathing that might have been his own, and the feeling of fighting as he never had, all out, for his life. He pushed the memory to one side, only to have it replaced by another, darker than the first, and older. Somewhere in the depths of his mind, one fight resonated with another. Damon's fingers dropped below the waterline. The other scar Damon carried was lower on his body. Not August. Not on a battlefield. Castor had run him through on his 13th birthday, during training. He remembered that day very clearly. He had scored a hit against Castor for the first time, and when he had pulled off his helm, giddy with triumph, Castor had smiled and suggested that they swap their wooden practice blades for real swords. Damon had felt proud. He had thought, "I am 13 and a man. Castor fights me like a man." Castor had not held back against him, and he had been so proud of that, even as the blood pushed out from beneath his hands. Now he remembered the black look in Castor's eyes, and thought that he had been wrong about many things. "Time's up," said Riddell. Damon nodded. He placed his hands on the edge of the baths. The ridiculous golden collar and cuffs still adorned his throat and wrists. The braziers were now covered, but the lingering scent of the incense was a little dizzying. Damon shook the momentary weakness away and pushed himself up out of the hot baths, streaming water. Riddell was staring at him, wide-eyed. Damon ran a hand through his hair, wringing out the water. Riddell's eyes widened. When Damon took a step forward, Riddell took an involuntary step back. "Restrain him," said Riddell, a little hoarsely. "You don't have to," said Damon. The wooden dock closed over his wrists. It was heavy and solid, immovable as a boulder or the trunk of a great tree. He rested his forehead against the dock, the wet tendrils of his hair turning the grain dark where they touched the wood. "I wasn't planning to fight," said Damon. "I'm glad to hear it," said Riddell. Dried, oiled with scent, the excess oil wiped off with a cloth. No worse than had happened to him in Aquilos. The touches of the servants were brisk and perfunctory, even when they handled his genitals. There was no whiff of sensuality in the preparations as there had been when Damon had been touched by the slave with the yellow hair in the Aquilan baths. It was not the worst thing that he had been asked to bear. One of the servants stepped behind him and began to prepare the entrance to his body. Damon jerked so forcefully that the wood creaked, and behind him he heard the smash of an oil container against the tile and a yelp from one of the servants. "Hold him down," said Riddell, grimly. They released him from the dock when it was over, and this time his docility was faintly laced with shock, and he was, for a few moments, less aware of what was going on around him. He felt changed by what had just happened to him. No, he was not changed. It was his situation that was changed. He realized that this aspect of his captivity, this danger, despite Laurent's threats, had not previously been real. No paint, Riddell was telling one of the servants. The prince doesn't like it. Jewelry? No. The gold is adequate. Yes, those garments. No, without the embroidery. The blindfold was tied around his eyes, tight. A moment later, Damon felt ringed fingers on his jawline, lifting it, as though Riddell wished simply to admire the picture he made. Blindfolded, arms lashed behind his back. Riddell said, "Yes, that will do, I think." That's a scene break. This time, when the blindfold was lifted, it was on a set of double doors, heavy gilded, that were pushed open. The room was thronging with courtiers. Can I not settle on a way to say that? Lord. The room was thronging with courtiers and decked out for an indoor spectacle. Cushioned stands ringed each of the room's four sides. The effect was that of a claustrophobic, silk-draped amphitheater. There was an air of considerable excitement. Ladies and young lords leaned in and whispered into one another's ears or murmured behind raised hands. Servants attended courtiers, and there was fine wine and refreshments, and silver trays heaped with sweetmeats and candied fruit. In the center of the room was a circular depression with a series of iron links set into the floor. Damon's stomach twisted. His gaze swung back to the courtiers in the stands. Not just courtiers. Among the more soberly dressed lords and ladies were exotic creatures in brightly colored silks, showing glimpses of flesh, their beautiful faces daubed with paint. Here was a young woman wearing almost more gold than Damon, 2 long circling armbands shaped like snakes. Here, a stunning red-haired youth with a coronet of emeralds and a delicate chain of silver and peridot around his waist. It was as though the courtiers displayed their wealth through their pets, like a noble showering jewels on an already expensive courtesan. That detail really, there are so many details that fuck you up in this trilogy because it's very well thought out. And using your pleasure slaves as an opportunity to display wealth is so... It's a little like it makes too much sense. I am sure that is actually, a thing somewhere in history or the world. It's a thing that you hadn't considered until it's described. And then you're like, no, actually, they would, wouldn't they? Damon saw an older man in the stands with a young child beside him, a proprietary arm around the boy, perhaps a father who had brought his son to view a favorite sport. He smelled a sweet scent familiar from the baths and saw a lady breathing deeply from a long, thin pipe curled at one end. Her eyes were half closed as she was fondled by the jeweled pet beside her. All across the stands, hands moved slowly over flesh in a dozen minor acts of debauchery. This was Vere, voluptuous and decadent, country of honeyed poison. Damon recalled the last night before dawn at Marlis, with the Varetian tents over the river, rich silk pennants lifting in the night air, the sounds of laughter and superiority, and the herald who had spat on the ground in front of his father. Damon realized he had balked on the threshold when the chain on his collar yanked him forward. One step, another. Better to walk than be dragged by the neck. He didn't know whether to be relieved or disturbed when he was not taken directly to the ring, but was instead flung down in front of a seat draped with blue silk and bearing that familiar starburst pattern in gold, mark of the Crown Prince. His chain was cinched to a link in the floor. His view, as he looked up, was of an elegant, boot-clad leg. If Laurent had been drinking to excess last night, nothing in his manner today showed it. He looked fresh, unconcerned and fair, his golden hair bright above clothing of a blue so dark it was almost black. His blue eyes were as innocent as the sky. Only if you looked carefully could you see something genuine in them, such as dislike. Damon would have attributed it to spite, that Laurent intended to make him pay for having overheard the exchange last night with his uncle. But the truth was, Laurent had looked at him like that from the first moment he had laid eyes on him. You have a cut on your lip. Someone hit you. Oh, that's right. I recall. You stood still and let him. Does it hurt? He was worse, sober. Damon purposefully relaxed his hands, which, restrained behind his back, had become fists. We must have some conversation. You see, I have asked after your health, and now I am reminiscing. I fondly remember our night together. Have you been thinking about me this morning? There was no good answer to that question. Damon's mind unexpectedly supplied him with a memory of the baths, the heat of the water, the sweet scent of the incense, the curl of steam. You have a scar. That would be in his head. My uncle interrupted us just as things were getting interesting. It left me curious. Laurent's expression was guileless, but he was systematically turning over stones, searching for weakness. You did something to make Castor hate you. What was it? Hate me, said Damon, looking up, hearing the reaction in his voice, despite his resolution not to engage. Those words worked on him. Did you think he sent you to me out of love? What did you do to him? Beat him in a tournament? Or fuck his mistress? What was her name? Jocaste. Maybe, said Laurent, his eyes widening a little. You strayed after he fucked you. That idea revolted him so much, took him so unawares, that he tasted bile in his throat. No. Laurent's blue eyes gleamed. So that's it. Castor mounts his soldiers like horses in the yard. Did you grit your teeth and take it because he was the king, or did you like it? You really, said Laurent, have no idea how happy that idea makes me. It's perfect. A man who holds you down while he fucks you, with a cock like a bottle and a beard like my uncle's. Damon realized he had physically drawn back. The chain had pulled taut. There was something obscene about someone with a face like that, speaking those words in a conversational voice. Further unpleasantness was prevented by the approach of a select group of courtiers, to whom Laurent presented an angelic countenance. Damon stiffened when he recognized Councillor Guyon, dressed in heavy dark clothing, with his councillor's medallion around his neck. From the brief words that Laurent spoke in greeting, he gathered that the woman with the commanding air was called Vans, and the man with the peaked nose was Estienne. It's so rare to see you at these entertainments, your highness, said Van. I was in the mood to enjoy myself, said Laurent. Your new pet is causing quite a stir. Vans walked around Damon as he spoke. He's nothing like the slaves that Castor gifted to your uncle. I wonder if your highness has had the chance to see them. They're much more... I've seen them. You don't sound pleased. Castor sends 24 slaves, trained to worm their way into the bedchambers of the most powerful members of court. I'm overjoyed. What an entirely pleasant sort of espionage, said Vans, arranging herself comfortably. But the regent keeps the slaves on a tight leash, I hear, and has not loaned them out at all. Regardless, I hardly doubt we'll see them in the ring. They didn't have quite the... elan. Estienne sniffed and gathered his pet to him, a delicate flower who looked like he would bruise if you so much as brushed a petal. Not everyone has your taste for pets who can sweep the ring competitions, Van. I, for one, am relieved to hear that all the slaves in Aquilos are not like this one. They're not, are they? This last a little nervously. No, Councillor Guyon spoke with authority. None of them are. Among the Aquila nobility, dominance is a sign of status. The slaves are all submissive. I suppose it's intended as a compliment to you, your highness, to imply that you can break a slave as strong as this one. No, it wasn't. Castor was amusing himself at everyone's expense, a living hell for his half-brother and a backhand insult to Vere. As for his provenance, they have arena matches regularly, sword, dagger, and spear. I'd guess he was one of the display fighters. It's truly barbaric. They wear almost nothing during the sword fights, and they fight the wrestling matches nude. Like pets, laughed one of the courtiers. The conversation turned to gossip. Damon heard nothing useful in it, but then he was having difficulty concentrating. The ring, with its promise of humiliation and violence, was holding most of his attention. He thought, so the regent keeps a close watch on his slaves. At least that's something. This new alliance with Aquilos can't sit easily with you, your highness, said Estienne. Everyone knows how you feel about that country, their barbaric practices, and of course what happened at Marlis. The space around him was suddenly very quiet. My uncle is regent, Laurent said. You are 21 in spring. Then you would do well to be prudent in my presence as well as my uncle's. Yes, your highness, said Estienne, bowing briefly and moving off to one side, acknowledging it for the dismissal it was. Something was happening in the ring. 2 male pets had entered and were standing off with slight wariness in the manner of competitors. One was a brunette with long lashed almond eyes. The other, to whom Damon's attention naturally gravitated, was blonde. Though his hair was not the buttercup yellow of Laurent's, it was darker, a sandy color, and his eyes weren't blue, they were brown. Damon felt a shift in the constant low-grade tension that had been with him since the baths, since he had woken in this place on silk cushions. In the ring, the pets were being stripped of their clothes. Sweetmeat, said Laurent. He held the confection delicately between thumb and forefinger, just far enough out of reach that Damon would have to rise up onto his knees in order to eat it from Laurent's fingertips. Damon jerked his head back. Stubborn, Laurent remarked mildly, bringing the treat to his own lips instead, and eating it. A range of equipment was on display alongside the ring. Long gilt poles, various restraints, a series of golden balls such as a child might play with, a little pile of silver bells, long whips, the handles decorated with ribbons and tassels. It was obvious that the entertainments in the ring were varied and inventive. But the one that unfolded in front of him now was simple. Rape. The pets knelt with their arms around one another, and an officiator held a red scarf aloft, then dropped it, fluttering to the ground. The pretty picture that the pets made quickly dissolved into a heaving tussle before the sounds of the crowd. Both pets were attractive, and both were lightly muscled. Neither possessed the build of a wrestler, but they did look marginally stronger than some of the willowy exquisites who curled around their masters in the audience. The brunette was first to gain the advantage, stronger than the blonde. Damon realized what was happening in front of him, as every whisper he had heard in Aquilos of the depravities of the Varetian court began unfolding before his eyes. The brunette was on top, his knee forcing the blonde's thighs open. The blonde was trying desperately to throw him off, and it wasn't working. The brunette held the blonde's arms behind his back and scrabbled, humping ineffectually. And then he was in. Smooth as entering a woman, though the blonde was struggling. The blonde had been prepared. The blonde let out a cry and tried to buck his captor off, but the motion only drove him deeper. Damon's eyes swung away, but it was almost worse to look at the audience. Lady Van's pet sat with flushed cheeks, her mistress's fingers well occupied. To Damon's left, the red-haired boy was unlacing the front of his master's garments and wrapping a hand around what he found there. In Aquilos, slaves were discreet. Public performances were erotic without being overt, the charms of a slave to be enjoyed in private. The court did not gather to watch two of them fucking. Here the atmosphere was almost orgiastic, and it was impossible to block out the sounds. Only Laurent seemed immune. He was probably so jaded that this display did not even cause his pulse to flicker. He sat in a graceful sprawl, one wrist balanced on the armrest of the box seat. At any moment he might contemplate his nails. In the ring, the performance was approaching its culmination. And by now, it was a performance. The pets were adept in playing to their audience. The sounds that the blonde was making had changed in quality and were rhythmic in time with the thrusts. The brunette was going to ride him to climax. The blonde was stubbornly resisting, biting his lip to try and hold himself back, but with every jarring thrust he was driven closer until his body shivered and gave of itself. The brunette pulled out and came, messily, all over his back. Damon knew what was coming, even as the blonde's eyes opened, even as he was helped from the ring by a servant of his master, who fussed over him solicitously and gifted him with a long diamond earring. Laurent lifted refined fingers into a prearranged signal to the guard. Hands clamped down on his shoulders. Damon's chain was detached from his collar, and when he did not spring into the ring like a dog released to the hunt, he was sent there at sword point. You kept pestering me to put a pet in the ring, Laurent was saying to Vans and the other courtiers who had joined him. I thought it was time I indulged you. It was nothing like entering the arena in Aquilos, where the fight was a show of excellence and the prize was honor. Damon was released from the last of his bonds and stripped of his garments, which were not many. It was impossible that this was happening. He felt again a strange sort of sick dizziness. Shaking his head slightly, needing to clear it, he looked up and saw his opponent. Laurent had threatened to have him raped. And here was the man who was going to do it. There was no way this brute was a pet. Big-boned and heavy-muscled, he outweighed Damon, with a further thick layer of flesh overlying the muscle. He had been chosen for his size, not his looks. His hair was a lank black cap. His chest was a thick pelt of hair that extended all the way down to his exposed groin. His nose was flat and broken. He was clearly no stranger to fights, though it was actually difficult to imagine anyone suicidal enough to punch this man in the nose. He had probably been dragged out of some mercenary company and told, "Fight the Aquilan, fuck him, and you'll be well rewarded." His eyes were cold as they passed over Damon's body. All right, he was outweighed. Under normal circumstances, that would not be a cause for anxiety. Wrestling was a trained discipline in Aquilos, and one Damon excelled at and enjoyed. But he had had days in harsh confinement, and yesterday had endured a beating. His body was tender in places, and his olive skin did not hide all the bruising. Here and there were the telltale signs that would show an opponent where to press down. He thought about that. He thought about the weeks since his capture in Aquilos. He thought about the beatings. He thought about the restraints. His pride was lashing its tail. He would not be raped in front of a room full of courtiers. They wanted to see a barbarian in the ring? Well, the barbarian could fight. It began, a little sickeningly, as it had begun with the two pets, on their knees with their arms around one another. The presence of two powerful adult men in the ring released something in the crowd that the pets had not, and the shouted insults, bets, and ribald speculation filled the room with noise. Closer, Damon could hear the breath of his mercenary opponent, could smell the rank masculine smell of the man, over the cloying perfumed roses of his own skin. The red scarf lifted. The first heave had enough force to break an arm. The man was a mountain, and when Damon matched strength to strength, he found, a little worryingly, that his earlier dizziness was with him still. There was something strange in the way that his limbs felt, sluggish. There was no time to think about it. Thumbs were suddenly seeking for his eyes. He twisted. Those parts of the body that were soft and tender, and that, in fair sport, would be avoided, must now be protected at all costs. His opponent was willing to tear, rip, and gouge, and Damon's body, otherwise hard and smooth, was newly vulnerable where it was bruised. The man he fought knew it. The pounding blows Damon suffered were all brutally aimed to land on old hurts. His opponent was vicious and formidable, and he had been instructed to do damage. Despite all this, the first advantage was Damon's. Outweighed in fighting that strange dizziness, he possessed skill that still counted for something. He gained a hold on the man, but when he tried to call on his strength to finish things, he found instead unsteady weakness. The air was suddenly expelled from his lungs after a driving blow to his diaphragm. The man had broken his hold. He found new leverage. He bore down with all his weight on the man's body and felt him shudder. It took more out of him than it should have. The man's muscles bunched under him, and this time, when the hold was broken, Damon felt a burst of pain in his shoulder. He heard his breath go uneven. Something was wrong. The weakness he felt was not natural. As another wave of dizziness passed over him, he thought suddenly of the oversweet smell in the baths, the incense in the brazier. A drug, he realized as his breath heaved. He had inhaled some sort of drug. Not just inhaled, had stewed in it. Nothing had been left to chance. Laurent had acted to make the outcome of this fight certain. A sudden renewed onslaught came, and he staggered. It took too long to regain himself. He grappled ineffectually. For a few moments neither man could sustain a grip. Sweat on the man's body glistened, making purchase more difficult. Damon's own body had been slightly oiled. The scented slave preparation gave him an ironic, unlooked-for advantage, momentarily protecting his virtue. He thought it was not the moment for stricken laughter. He felt the man's warm breath against his neck. In the next second, he was on his back, pinned, blackness threatening the edge of his vision as the man applied a crushing pressure against his windpipe above the gold collar. He felt the push of the man against him. The sound of the crowd surged. The man was trying to mount. Thrusting against Damon, the man's breath was now coming in soft grunts. Damon struggled to no avail, not strong enough to break this hold. His thighs were forced apart. No. He sought desperately for some weakness that could be exploited and found none. Goal in his sights, the man's attention split between restraint and penetration. Damon flung the last of his strength at the hold and felt it quaver, enough to shift their position slightly, enough to find leverage, an arm freed. He drove his fist sideways so that the heavy gold cuff on his wrist slammed hard into the man's temple, with the sick sound of an iron bar impacting on flesh and bone. A moment later, Damon followed up, perhaps unnecessarily, with his right fist, and smashed his stunned, swaying opponent into the dirt. He fell, heavy flesh collapsing, partially across Damon. Damon somehow pushed away, instinctively inserting distance between himself and the prone man. He coughed, his throat tender. When he found that he had air, he began the slow process of rising to his knees, and from there to his feet. Rape was out of the question. The little spectacle with the blonde pet had been all performance. Even these jaded courtiers did not expect him to fuck a man who was unconscious. Except that he could feel now the displeasure of the crowd. No one wanted to see an Aquilan triumph over a Varetian, least of all Laurent. The words of Councillor Guyon came back to him, almost crazily. It's in poor taste. It was not over. It was not enough to fight through a drug haze and win. There was no way to win. It was already clear that the regent's diktats did not extend to the entertainment in the ring. And whatever now happened to Damon would happen with the crowd's approbation. He knew what he had to do. Against every rebelling instinct, he forced himself forward and dropped to his knees before Laurent. I fight in your service, your highness. He searched his memory for Riddell's words and found them. I exist only to please my prince. May my victory reflect on your glory. He knew better than to look up. He spoke as clearly as he could, his words for the onlookers as much as they were for Laurent. He tried to look as deferential as possible. Exhausted and on his knees, he thought that wasn't difficult. If someone hit him right now, he'd fall over. Laurent extended his right leg slightly, the tip of his well-turned boot presenting itself to Damon. Kiss it, Laurent said. Damon's whole body reacted against the idea. His stomach heaved. His heart in the cage of his chest was pounding. One public humiliation substituted for another. But it was easier to kiss a foot than be raped in front of a crowd, wasn't it? Damon bent his head and pressed his lips to the smooth leather. He forced himself to do it with unhurried respect, as a vassal might kiss the ring of a liege lord. He kissed just the curve of the toe tip. In Aquilos, an eager slave might have continued upward, kissing the arch of Laurent's foot, or, if they were daring, higher, his firm calf muscle. He heard Councillor Guyon, "You've worked miracles. That slave was completely unmanageable aboard the ship." "Every dog can be brought to heel," said Laurent. "Magnificent." A smooth, cultured voice, one Damon didn't know. "Councillor Auden," said Laurent. Damon recognized the older man he had glimpsed in the audience earlier, the one who had sat with his son or nephew. His clothing, though it was dark like Laurent's, was very fine. Not, of course, as fine as a prince's, but close to it. "What a victory! Your slave deserves a reward. Let me offer one to him." "A reward," Laurent, flatly. "A fight like that, truly magnificent, but with no climax. Allow me to offer him a pet in place of his intended conquest. I think," said Auden, "that we are all eager to see him really perform." Damon's gaze swung around to the pet. It was not over. Perform, he thought, and felt sick. The young boy was not the man's son. He was a pet, not yet adolescent, with thin limbs and his growth spurt still far in the future. It was obvious that he was petrified of Damon. The little barrel of his chest was rising and falling rapidly. He was, at the oldest, 14. He looked more like 12. Damon saw his chances of returning to Aquilos gutter and die like candle flame, and all the doors to freedom close. Obey. Play by the rules. Kiss the prince's shoe. Jump through his hoops. He had really thought he would be able to do that. He gathered the last of his strength to himself and said, "Do whatever you want to me. I'm not going to rape a child." Laurent's expression flickered. Objection came from an unexpected quarter. "I'm not a child." Sulkily. But when Damon looked incredulously at him, the boy promptly went white and looked terrified. Laurent was looking from Damon to the boy and back again, frowning as if something didn't make sense or wasn't going his way. "Why not?" he said abruptly. "Why not?" said Damon. "I don't share your craven habit of hitting only those who cannot hit back, and I take no pleasure in hurting those weaker than myself." Driven past reason, the words came out in his own language. Laurent, who could speak his language, stared back at him, and Damon met his eyes and did not regret his words, feeling nothing but loathing. "Your Highness?" said Auden, confused. Laurent turned to him eventually. "The slave is saying that if you want the pet unconscious, split in half, or dead of fright, then you will need to make other arrangements. He declines his services." He pushed up out of the box seat, and Damon was almost driven backwards as Laurent strode past, ignoring his slave. Damon heard him say to one of the servants, "Have my horse brought to the north courtyard. I'm going for a ride." And then it was over. Finally and unexpectedly, it was somehow over. Auden frowned and departed. His pet trotted after him, after an indecipherable look at Damon. As for Damon, he had no idea what had just happened. In the absence of other orders, his escort had him dressed and prepared to return to the harem. Looking around himself, he saw that the ring was now empty, though he hadn't noticed whether the mercenary had been carried out or had risen and walked out of his own accord. Across the ring was a thin trail of blood. A servant was on his knees mopping at it. Damon was being maneuvered past a blur of faces. One of them was Lady Vans, who, unexpectedly, addressed him. "You look surprised. Were you hoping to enjoy that boy after all? You had better get used to it. The prince has a reputation for leaving pets unsatisfied." Her laughter, a low glissando, joined the sounds of voices and entertainment, as across the amphitheater the courtiers returned, with almost no ripple of interruption, to their afternoon pastime. That's the end of the chapter. Yeah. I also forgot that happened so early. Like chapter 2 early. I knew it happened towards the beginning, but I had forgotten that it was like within the first 50 pages. We're now on page 51 for chapter 3. That rounds out the first 50 pages. And that's just difficult every single frickin' time. And I feel like now is a important moment to point out that how to phrase this. So when it comes to dark subject matter like this, it is so oftentimes reduced to like a really bad game of telephone. So it becomes like a lot of people being outraged, but a lot of them haven't read it themselves or don't know the full context. They just know what they were told by somebody else. And then now it all gets out of hand and it all gets very, very fraught and high-key and anxious and emotional all at once. I will say, however, that a lot of people, for very understandable reasons, bail from Captive Prince pretty early on. And again, fully understandable. But I will also say that if you have only read the first book of Captive Prince, you have not read Captive Prince. With anything, but especially with stories like Captive Prince, if you have not seen it all, then you are going without so much information, just so much context and placement and reasoning, and just you cannot see the full picture with anything if you only read the first book out of the trilogy, but especially with things like this. So, as I like to say, and as I have said over the many years that I have read and loved this series, if you haven't read all 3 books, if you've only read the first book, you haven't read Captive Prince. And it's very, very easy for people to get very, very intense with their response for understandable reasons. And people get very angry very quickly. But you have to see it all. So, this is a good time to mention that. And it also takes being recommended by somebody you trust. By somebody who can assure you to finish the whole thing, or that wherever your fictional lines are for dark content, you definitely need the recommendation of somebody trusted who can verify that for you specifically, it does not cross any lines you may have. Or maybe it does, because obviously, again, the first 50 pages put a lot of people off of this trilogy. But it also meant that there was a lot of judgment about this trilogy that was uninformed. Anyway, we are already at 5. However, I'm going to make a little exception and go for a little bit more and get a little bit into Chapter 3. We won't be able to finish all of Chapter 3 because these chapters tend to be a bit chunky. So like this, Chapter 3 is like 20 pages. We may only get halfway through, or maybe not even that. Who can say? But we are going to go ahead and get into a little bit of Chapter 3 and go a little bit over the usual mark because we kind of started late and, you know, we had a break and everything, and it's a special occasion. So we're going to sit here for a little bit more and get into Chapter 3, and I'll see if I can find a natural place to stop within the chapter, because there also seem to be a fair amount of scene breaks and everything, so there should be a good stopping point. All right. Before the blindfold was fixed in place, Damon saw that the men returning him to his room were the same 2 men who yesterday had administered the beating. He didn't know the taller one's name, but he knew from overheard exchanges that the shorter was called Jord. 2 men. It was the smallest escort of his imprisonment, but blindfolded and securely bound, not to mention worn out, he had no way to take advantage of it. The restraints were not taken off until he was once again back in his room, chained by the neck. The men didn't leave. Jord stood by while the taller man closed the door with himself and Jord on the inside. Damon's first thought was that they had been told to deliver a repeat performance, but then he saw that they were lingering of their own accord, not under orders. That might be worse. He waited. "So you like a fight?" said the taller man. Hearing the tone, Damon prepared himself for the fact that he might be facing another one. "How many men did it take to collar you in Aquilos?" "More than 2, said Damon. It did not go down well. Not with the taller man, at any rate. Jord took his arm, holding him back. "Leave it," said Jord. "We're not even supposed to be in here." Jord, although shorter, was also broader across the shoulders. There was a brief moment of resistance before the taller man left the room. Jord remained, his own speculative attention now on Damon. "Thank you," said Damon, neutrally. Jord looked back at him, obviously weighing up whether or not to speak. I'm no friend of... Ooh, is it Govart or Jovart? It's the classic GIF and GIF debate all over again. Govart. I think it would be Govart. I'm no friend of Govart, he said finally. Damon thought at first that Govart was the other guard, but he learned otherwise when Jord said, You must have a death wish to knock out the Regent's favorite thug. The Regent's what? Said Damon, feeling his stomach sink. Govart. He was thrown out of the King's Guard for being a real son of a bitch. The Regent keeps him around. No idea how the prince got him in the ring, but that one would do anything to piss off his uncle. And then, seeing Damon's expression, What, you didn't know who he was? No, he hadn't known. Damon's understanding of Laurent rearranged itself in order that he might despise him more accurately. Apparently, in case a miracle happened and his drugged slave managed to win the ring fight, Laurent had arranged for himself a consolation prize. Damon had unwittingly earned himself a new enemy, Govart. Not only that, but beating Govart in the ring could be taken as a direct slight by the Regent. Laurent, selecting Damon's opponent with precise malice, would, of course, have known that. Oh, Laurent. This was Vere, Damon reminded himself. Laurent might talk like he'd been raised on the floor of a brothel, but he had a Varetian courtier's mind, used to deception and double-dealing, and his petty plots were dangerous to someone as much in his power as Damon. It was mid-morning the next day when Riddell entered, here once again to see Damon's transport to the baths. You were successful in the ring and even paid the prince a respectful obeisance. That is excellent. And I see you haven't struck anyone all morning. Well done, Riddell said. Damon digested this compliment. He said, What was the drug you doused me with before the fight? There was no drug, said Riddell, sounding a bit appalled. There was something, said Damon. You put it in the braziers. Ooh, that was... Ooh. Chalice? French, because it's, italicized. Well, French-inspired, so you could largely go by the French pronunciation rules. But even then, Chalice? We'll go with Chalice, but again, I'm writing that down to double-check later. That was Chalice. Maybe it's Chalice. A refined divertissement. Divertissement. Yeah. There is nothing sinister about it. The prince suggested that it might help you relax in the baths. And did the prince also suggest the amount? Said Damon. Yes, said Riddell, more than usual, since you're quite large. I wouldn't have thought of that. He has a mind for details. Yes, I'm learning that, said Damon. He thought that it would be the same as the previous day, that he was being taken to the baths to be prepared for some new grotesquerie. But all that happened was that the handlers bathed him, returned him to his room, and brought him lunch on a platter. The bathing was more pleasant than it had been the day before. No Chalice, no handling of intrusive intimacy, and he was given a luxurious body massage, his shoulder checked for any sign of strain or injury, his lingering bruises treated very gently. As the day waned and nothing whatsoever occurred, Damon realized he felt a sense of anticlimax, almost disappointment, which was absurd. Better to spend the day bored on silk cushions than spend it in the ring. Maybe he just wanted another chance to fight something, preferably an insufferable yellow-haired princeling. Nothing happened on the second day, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth. The passing of time inside this exquisite prison became its own ordeal. The only thing that interrupted his days was the routine of his meals and the morning bath. He used the time to learn what he could. The change of guard at his door happened at times that were intentionally irregular. The guards no longer behaved towards him as though he were a piece of furniture, and he learned several of their names. The ring fight had changed something. No one else broke orders to enter his room without instruction, but once or twice one of the men handling him would speak words to him, though the exchanges were brief. A few words, here and there. It was something he worked on. He was attended by servants who provided his meals, emptied the copper pot, lit torches, extinguished torches, plumped the cushions, changed them, scrubbed the floor, aired the room, but it was, so far, impossible to build a relationship with any of them. They were more obedient to the order not to speak to him than the guards, or they were more afraid of Damon. Once he had gotten as much as startled eye contact and a blush. That had happened when Damon, sitting with a knee drawn up and his head resting against the wall, had taken pity on the servant boy attempting to do his work while cleaving to the door, and said, "It's all right. The chain's very strong." The abortive attempts he made to get information from Riddell met with resistance and a series of patronizing lectures. Gaywatch, said Riddell, was not a royally sanctioned thug. Where had Damon gotten that idea? The regent kept Gaywatch in employ out of some kind of obligation, possibly to Gaywatch's family. Why was Damon asking about Gaywatch? Did he not recall that he was here only to do as he was told? There was no need to ask questions. There was no need to concern himself with the goings-on in the palace. He should put everything out of his mind but the thought that he must please the prince, who, in 10 months, would be king. By now, Damon had the speech memorized. That's a scene break. Just going to check real quick for when the next one is or something like that. The next one is a while. So we'll see if there's an easier place to stop before then. By the 6th day, the trip to the baths had become routine, and he expected nothing from it, except that today the routine varied. His blindfold was removed outside the baths, not in it. Riddell's critical gaze was on him, as one surveying merchandise. Was it in fit condition? It was. Damon felt himself being released from his restraints. Here, outside. Riddell said briefly, "Today in the baths, you will serve." "Serve?" said Damon. That word conjured up the curved alcoves and their purpose, and the etched figures intertwined. There was no time to absorb the idea or to ask questions. Much as he had been propelled into the ring, he was pushed forward into the baths. The guards closed the doors with themselves on the outside and became half-seen shadows behind the latticed metal. Oh, we're doing this part. He wasn't sure what he expected. Perhaps a debauched tableau such as had greeted him in the ring. Perhaps pets sprawled out on every surface, naked and steam-drenched. Perhaps a scene in motion, bodies already moving, soft sounds or splashes in the water. In fact, the baths were empty, except for one person. As yet untouched by the steam, clothed from toe-tip to neck, and standing in the place where slaves were washed before they entered the soaking bath. When Damon saw who it was, he instinctively lifted a hand to his gold collar, unable to quite believe that he was unrestrained and that they were alone together. Laurent reclined against the tiled wall, settling his shoulders flat against it. He regarded Damon with a familiar expression of golden-lashed dislike. "So my slave is bashful in the arena. Don't you fuck boys in Aquilos?" "I'm quite cultured. Before I rape anyone, I first check to see if their voice is broken," said Damon. Laurent smiled. "Did you fight at Marlis?" Damon did not react to the smile, which was not authentic. The conversation was now on a knife edge. He said, "Yes." "How many did you kill?" "I don't know." "Lost count?" Pleasantly, as one might inquire about the weather. Laurent said, "The barbarian won't fuck boys. He prefers to wait a few years and then use a sword in place of his cock." Damon flushed. It was battle. There was death on both sides. "Oh, yes. We killed a few of you, too. I would like to have killed more, but my uncle is unaccountably clement with vermin. You've met him." Laurent resembled one of the etched figures of the intaglio, except that he was done in white and gold, not silver. Damon looked at him and thought, "This is the place where you had me drugged." "Have you waited 6 days to talk to me about your uncle?" Damon said. Laurent rearranged himself against the wall in a position that looked even more indolently comfortable than the one before. "My uncle has ridden to Chestillon." "Chestillon?" "He hunts boar. He likes the chase. He likes to kill, too. It's a day's ride." after which he and his party will stay 5 nights at the old keep. His subjects know better than to bother him with missives from the palace. I have waited 6 days, so that you and I could be alone. Those sweet blue eyes gazed at him. It was, when you shook off the sugared tone, a threat. Alone, with your men guarding the doors, said Damon. Are you going to complain again that you're not allowed to hit back? Said Laurent. The voice sweetened further. Don't worry. I won't hit you unless I have a good reason. Did I seem worried? Said Damon. You seemed a little agitated, said Laurent. In the ring. I liked it best when you were on your hands and knees, cur. Do you think I will tolerate insolence? By all means, try my patience. Damon was silent. He could feel the steam now curling heat against his skin. He could feel, too, the danger. He could hear himself. No soldier would talk this way to a prince. A slave would have been on his hands and knees the second he saw that Laurent was in the room. Shall I tell you the part you liked? Said Laurent. There was nothing I liked. You're lying. You liked knocking that man down, and you liked it when he didn't get up. You'd like to hurt me, wouldn't you? Is it very difficult to control yourself? Your little speech about fair play fooled me about as much as your show of obedience. You have worked out, with whatever native intelligence you possess, that it serves your interests to appear both civilized and dutiful. But the one thing you're hot for is a fight. Are you here to goad me into one? Said Damon, in a new voice that seemed to rise up from deep within him. Laurent pushed off the wall. I don't roll in the sty with swine, said Laurent coolly. I'm here to bathe. Have I said something astonishing? Come here. It was a moment before Damon found he could obey. The instant he had entered the room, he had weighed the option of physically overpowering Laurent and dismissed it. He would not make it out of the palace alive if he hurt or killed Vare's crown prince. That decision had not come without some regret. He came to stand 2 steps away. As well as dislike, he was surprised to find there was something assessing in Laurent's expression, as well as something self-satisfied. He had expected bravado. Certainly there were guards outside the door, and at a sound from their prince they would likely come bursting and bristling with swords, but there was no guarantee that Damon wouldn't lose his temper and kill Laurent before that happened. Another man might. Another man might think that the inevitable retribution, some sort of public execution ending with his head on a spike, was worth it for the pleasure of wringing Laurent's neck. Strip, said Laurent. Nudity had never bothered him. He knew by now that it was prescribed among the Varetian nobility. But even if Varetian customs had concerned him, everything there was to see had been seen very publicly. He unpinned his garments and let them fall. He was unsure what the point of this was, unless this feeling was the point. Undress me, said Laurent. The feeling intensified. He ignored it and stepped forward. The foreign clothing gave him pause. Laurent extended a coolly peremptory hand, palm up, indicating a starting point. The tight little lacings on the underside of Laurent's wrist continued about halfway up his arm and were of the same dark blue as the garment. Untying them took several minutes. The laces were small, complicated, and tight, and he must pull each one individually through its hole, feeling the drag of the tie against the material of the eyelet. Laurent lowered one arm, trailing laces, and extended the other. In Aquilos, clothing was simple and minimal, with a focus on the aesthetics of the body. By contrast, Varetian clothing was concealing and seemed designed to frustrate and impede, its complexity serving no obvious purpose other than to make disrobing difficult. The methodical ritual of unlacing made Damon wonder, scornfully, if Varetian lovers suspended their passion for a half-hour in order to disrobe. Perhaps everything that happened in this country was deliberate and bloodless, including lovemaking. But no, he remembered the carnality of the ring. The pets had dressed differently, offering ease of access, and the red-haired pet had unlaced only that part of his master's clothing that was required for his purpose. When all the various lacings were untied, he drew the garment off. It was revealed to be an outer layer only. Beneath it was a simple white shirt, also laced, which had not previously been visible. Shirts, pants, boots. Damon hesitated. Golden brows arched. Am I here to wait on the modesty of a servant? So he knelt. The boots must be taken off. The pants were next. Damon stepped back when it was done. The shirt, now unlaced, had slipped slightly, exposing a shoulder. Laurent reached behind himself and drew it off. He was wearing nothing else. Damon's flinty dislike of Laurent forestalled his usual reaction to a well-shaped body. If not for that, he might have experienced a moment of difficulty. For Laurent was all of a piece. His body had the same impossible grace as his face. He was lighter built than Damon, but his body wasn't boyish. Instead, he possessed the beautifully proportioned musculature of a young man on the new cusp of adulthood, made for athletics or statuary. And he was fair. So fair, skin as fair as a young girl's, smooth and unmarked, with a glimmer of gold trailing down from his navel. In this overclothed society, Damon might have expected Laurent to display some self-consciousness, but Laurent seemed as coolly immodest about his nudity as he was about everything else. He stood much like a young god before whom a priest was about to make an offering. Wash me. Damon had never performed a servile task in his life, but he supposed that this one would not overwhelm either his pride or his comprehension. By now he knew the customs of the baths. He felt a sense of subtle satisfaction from Laurent and a corresponding internal resistance. It was an uncomfortably intimate form of attendance. He was not restrained, and they were alone, one man serving another. All the appurtenances had been carefully laid out. A fat-bellied silver pitcher, soft cloths, and bottles of oil and frothy liquid soap, made from clear-spun glass, their stoppers capped in silver. The one that Damon picked up depicted a vine heavy with grapes. He felt their contours under his fingers as he unstopped the little bottle with a tug against the resistant suction. He filled the silver pitcher. Laurent presented his back. Laurent's very fine skin, when Damon poured water over it, was like white pearl. His body under the slick soap was nowhere soft or yielding, but taut like an elegantly sprung bow. Damon supposed that Laurent partook of those refined sports that courtiers sometimes indulged in, and which the other participants would allow him, being their prince, to win. He continued from shoulders to lower back. The spill of water wet his own chest and thighs, where it ran in rivulets, leaving behind suspended droplets that glimmered and threatened at any moment to trail suddenly downwards. The water was hot when it pulsed up from the ground, and hot when he poured it from the silver pitcher. The air was hot. He was conscious of it. He was conscious of the rise and fall of his chest, of his breathing, of more than that. He remembered that in Aquilos he had been washed by a slave with yellow hair. Her coloring had matched Laurent's so closely they might have been twinned. She had been far less disagreeable. She had closed the distance of inches and pressed her body against his. He remembered her fingers curling around him, her nipples soft as bruised fruit where they pressed into his chest. A pulse beat in his neck. It was a poor time to lose control of his thoughts. He had now progressed far enough in this undertaking that he encountered curves. They were firm under his hands, and the soap made everything slippery. He looked down, and the washcloth slowed. The hothouse atmosphere of the baths only increased the impression of sensuality, and despite himself, Damon felt the first hardening between his legs. There was a change in the quality of the air, his desire suddenly tangible in the thick humidity of the room. "Don't be presumptuous," said Laurent coldly. "Too late, sweetheart," said Damon. Laurent turned, and with calm precision unleashed a backhanded blow that had easily enough force to bloody a mouth. But Damon had had quite enough of being hit, and he caught Laurent's wrist before the blow connected. They were motionless like that for a moment. Damon looked down into Laurent's face, the fair skin a little heat-flushed, the yellow hair wet at the tips, and under those golden lashes the arctic blue eyes. And when Laurent made a little spasming motion to free himself, he felt his grip on Laurent's wrist tighten. Damon let his gaze wander downwards, wet from chest to taut abdomen, and further. It was really a very, very nice body, but the cold outrage was genuine. Laurent was not even a little amorous. Damon noted. That part of him, quite as sweetly made as the rest, was quiescent. He felt the tension hit Laurent's body, though the tone didn't change overmuch from its usual drawl. But my voice has broken. That was the only prerequisite, wasn't it? Damon released his grip, as though burned. A moment later, the blow he had thwarted landed, harder than he could have imagined, smashing across his mouth. "Get him out of here," said Laurent. It was no louder than his speaking voice, but the doors swung open. Not even out of earshot. Damon felt hands on him as he was pulled roughly backwards. "Put him on the cross. Wait for me to arrive." "Your Highness, regarding the slave, the regent instructed, you can do as I say or you can go there in his place. Choose, now." It was not a choice at all, with the regent in Chastillon. "I have waited 6 days so that you and I could be alone." There was no further prevarication. "Yes, Your Highness." Yeah. That'll be where we stop for today, because that's a nice clean scene break. We are on page 64 in the middle of chapter 3. That, I feel, obviously a scene I remember pretty damn well, is a better sort of encapsulation of what to expect from Captive Prince than just stopping at page 50, if you know what I mean. So, that's the opening salvo of Captive Prince. I'm bursting with all kinds of things to say that I cannot say. Somebody mentioned it earlier, but it's very much knowing how the Urha people feel, the ones who have already read the series, or it's really how like anything that I react to is obviously reaction. So I deeply know how you guys feel now to be watching a thing and unable to gush about certain things to the person. I understand. I'm dying. I'm fucking dying. Oh, okay. So, woo. Damn. We are going to be reading all the way through the trilogy and probably to the little bonus novella as well. There is a post-canon short story, I believe, that is also, written by C.S. Picot that I have. So we will most likely do that as well, because I think I only ever read one of those stories, and I think there were more. So we will absolutely be doing that as well, but we're going straight through. So we'll be reading this through May and June, and should probably take us into a little bit of July, maybe to the mid of July, since we're already reading the novella. And this is for June. This is for Gay Pride this year. I have been wanting to get Captive Prince onto Gaywatch for a very, very long time. Since I started doing these reading streams, one of the main motivations was that one day I could do Captive Prince. And we're now here, so I'm freaking out a little bit. It's been 5 years of Gaywatch, and this is one of the best ways I could possibly think of to kick off the next 5. So I hope you had a time. If you were here for both the Q&A and Captive Prince all the way through from like beginning to end, you get like special brownie points. That's a lot of time to watch a person streaming things. Thank you very much to everybody who hopped in, hopped out, made the Q&A, didn't make the Q&A, what have you. If you're here, thank you so much. You guys are delightful. You have made this day entirely memorable. I will continue. I have not checked any numbers yet or anything like that. But I will continue to crowdfund for my ADHD assessment, which is such a big thing to ask for. But here we are. So that you can do through Ko-fi or Venmo is preferred. And I'm being bombarded with rainbow hearts again. Jesus Christ, guys. That is what's happening. It'll be Captive Prince, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you're new here, hello! This is quite a time to join. And don't worry about missing streams because they should be posted immediately after the stream ends. So you will not be missing anything. You can catch up whenever you need to. If you would like to enter for the giveaway of, it's this volume, of this lovely cover and volume of Captive Prince, then comment and like an actual comment on this live stream, not in the chat, in an actual comment below that you would like to be entered. And we'll be doing this for the next couple of streams to make sure that everyone enters who would like to. We are doing more than one giveaway of Captive Prince volumes during this whole Captive Prince thing. And, hot damn. I'm going to go collapse because I've been streaming a lot today. And I'm going to go enjoy the fact that I get to do this. After 5 years, I get to do this. And I have so many more things that I want to do. And so many more big dreams and ambitions that I have for this channel. And you guys being here, it makes my life. It really does. So I love you very, very much. And I deeply want you to take care of yourself. And I will see you on Tuesday for more of Captive Prince. Have a lovely weekend.